All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today's topic, well, actually, let me back up a bit. If you're a military history fan, then you are absolutely going to love this deep dive. So last time we left off with Julius Caesar, fresh off a couple of victories in Egypt and Bendu, and he was coming back to a Rome that's in the middle of a civil war. And that begs the question, did his assassination really mean the end of the Roman Republic? And if it did, then why was there a 17-year gap before the Roman Empire officially started?
Well, it's so interesting to think about how Caesar, who was a brilliant military strategist, by the way, had to figure out how to deal with this very, very volatile period.
Right, and his return to Rome in 46 BC after he beat Pompey wasn't just him, coming home. It was a really, really smart move strategically. So try to imagine this. Caesar, the conquering hero, comes back to a Rome that has totally surrendered to him. The Senate, the nobility, everybody's basically just giving up and laying down their arms. They even had 10 days of just constant parties. It must have been really something to see.
Oh, absolutely. But all those celebrations were just the beginning. You see, this surrender to Caesar's authority gave him exactly what he needed to make some pretty big changes. I mean, these were radical reforms, and he didn't waste any time at all.
So let's dive into those reforms. Because they weren't just some old laws. They actually changed the course of Roman history. And because of that, they changed European history as we know it forever. First, he makes the Senate way bigger. It went from 300 members to 900. You would think that would weaken his power, right? Because his opponents would have more of a voice.
Yeah, that's what most people think. But Caesar was thinking way ahead.
Oh.
By making the Senate bigger, he could fill it with people who were loyal to him.
Oh,
This way he could control this very important group.
It was like he was pretending to be inclusive, but really he was just getting more control.
Exactly.
But he didn't just change the Senate. He also changed how the Roman provinces were run.
That's right. Caesar knew that real power meant controlling more than just Rome itself. He changed the way taxes and administration worked in the provinces. He even gave Roman citizenship to people in allied territories.
Smart.
This made his power base much, much bigger.
It stretched way beyond just the city of Rome. And then there's this little reform that we still feel the impact of today. I'm talking about the Julian calendar.
Oh, right. Such a huge change.
Yeah, this one seems kind of boring, but it had a gigantic effect.
It really did.
Changing the ancient Roman calendar to a 12-month system wasn't just about simplifying things.
It was about creating order and making things standard across the entire Roman world.
Right.
And the fact that we're still basically using a calendar that Caesar created proves just how big of an impact it made.
It's incredible to think that something decided over 2,000 years ago still affects our lives every day. But these reforms, all these changes to Roman society, were only possible because Caesar had complete and total power.
And that's where things start to get really interesting. You see, Caesar's dictatorship was completely different from the dictatorships that came before him, like the one Sulla had.
Also,
Sulla wanted to give the Senate more power, but Caesar basically became the power.
interesting. So by 44 BC, he had more power than anyone ever had before.
Right.
He was Grand Marshal High Priest. And get this, he was called Father of the Nation. He wasn't just a dictator. He was like the physical representation of Roman power, both religious and non-religious.
That Father of the Nation title is so interesting. It wasn't just a name. It actually linked Caesar back to old Roman traditions and to heroes like Camillus, who saved Rome from the Gauls a long time ago. It was a very deliberate attempt to make his rule seem legitimate, to make people believe that he was continuing Rome's glorious history.
I wonder if the everyday Roman really believed that, though. Did they see him as a legitimate leader, or did they just think he was a good politician who wanted all the power?
Well, it was probably a mix of both. But no matter what people thought, Caesar's power and ambition made some people very angry. He had powerful enemies,
Right.
and they were getting more and more resentful.
And that leads us to the very interesting case of Marcus Brutus.
Mm.
You know, the guy whose mother was Caesar's mistress for a long time? Caesar practically raised him like a son.
Yes. It's a strange twist of fate, isn't it? Caesar was very good to Brutus, but Brutus still resented him. It was probably because of a lot of different reasons, some personal and some political.
Wow. So you've got this resentment mixed with the unease that other powerful Romans were feeling. And that all set the stage for one of the most famous conspiracies in history. And there were a few specific events that led up to the plot against Caesar.
Right. The first one was almost a public relations disaster. Antony, who was Caesar's right-hand man and a great military leader himself, called Caesar king in public. Now, Caesar didn't accept the title, but a lot of people thought it was a way to see how the public felt about it.
Yeah, that would definitely make people wonder what was going on. After all, Caesar already had a ton of power. This whole king thing, even if it was just a test, must have really scared the people who were already afraid of him.
Oh, it definitely did. It made his opponents even more paranoid, and it gave them a reason to do something. And then there was that prophecy about Caesar's plan to attack Parthia.
Oh, yeah, the Parthian campaign. Caesar was getting ready for this huge military operation. He wanted to conquer one of Rome's toughest enemies. But then some oracle pops up and says that only a king can conquer Parthia.
Right. That was like pouring gasoline on a fire. For Caesar's supporters, it probably seemed like it was meant to be like he was destined to be king. But for his enemies, it was a sign that he wanted to take all the power for himself.
So you have all this going on at the same time. Caesar's power is growing. Antony makes that mistake, and then there's that prophecy. It was a perfect storm that led to Caesar's downfall.
And it all came to a head on March 1544 BC, the Ides of March. Caesar was tricked into going to the Senate. They told him it was to read a petition, but it was a trap.
This is the moment everyone's been waiting for. It's like a scene from a movie. You can almost hear the gasps in the Senate when Cassius, one of the conspirators, stabs Caesar in the neck, and then it's just chaos, a bunch of senators all with knives stabbing him.
And one of the last people to stab him was Brutus, the guy Caesar treated like his own son. History books really paint a clear picture of how crazy and violent that day was.
It's a very powerful and sad image. And what's even more interesting is the debate about Caesar's last words. Did he really say, et tu Bruta, like in Shakespeare's play?
Historians still argue about whether he really said those words.
You too, Brutus.
But no matter what his actual last words were, Caesar's death shocked people all over Rome and even beyond. It was a massive event that changed the course of European history.
But even with all the drama and violence, the Roman Empire didn't start right away after the assassination. Instead, a power struggle began, and it lasted for 17 years. So what happened during those years? What changed the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire? That's what we're going to find out next time. Okay, so Caesar is dead, but Rome doesn't just immediately turn into an empire. Instead, there's almost 20 years of people fighting for power alliances changing and, well, a lot of bloodshed.
Yeah, you have to understand that these 17 years weren't just like a waiting period or something. It was a time of huge conflict with people fighting over their beliefs and ambitions, and all of that would decide what happened to Rome.
So it's like a Roman Game of Thrones, but with togas and legions instead of dragons. So who are the main players in all of this?
Well, you had the people who were loyal to Caesar. They were led by Mark Antony, a very experienced general and politician. He was Caesar's right-hand man. Then you had the senators who didn't like Caesar. They were trying to get their power back. And then there's this wild card, a young guy who would change everything. Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir.
Octavian, the one who would eventually become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But at this point, he's just a teenager, right?
He was young, but he inherited something much more valuable than just Caesar's money. He inherited his name, his legacy, and the loyalty of a lot of Roman legions.
Wow.
Octavian was ambitious and smart, but most importantly, he was patient. He was willing to wait for the right moment, and that's what made him different from his rivals.
Okay, so we have these three major players. Antony, the experienced general, the old senators who wanted to go back to the way things were, and Octavian, the young guy with a famous name and a powerful legacy. What were some of the big things that happened during this time?
Well, at first, Antony tried to make a deal with the Senate. He hoped to keep things stable and prevent more fighting, but it didn't work out.
What?
Because they didn't trust each other, and they were all trying to get more power for themselves.
It seems like everyone was still angry about the Civil War. And then there's the whole thing with Cleopatra. She wasn't just Caesar's ex-lover. She was the Queen of Egypt, a very powerful person.
Right. Antony wanted more power and resources, so he made an alliance with Cleopatra. Remember, she had also had a son with Caesar.
Yeah.
This alliance was a big deal politically and personally. It really shook up the Roman world.
So this isn't just about power. It's about personal grudges, love affairs, and maybe even revenge.
Yeah.
It makes things way more complicated.
Exactly. Antony and Cleopatra controlled a lot of land and resources. This was a direct threat to the Senate and to Octavian. It was a huge clash, a battle for the heart of Rome.
It sounds like a movie. Armies fighting epic battles at sea, maybe even some gladiators.
You're not too far off. This power struggle ended with a big battle. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was a huge naval battle, Antony and Cleopatra's forces against Octavian's fleet. Octavian's fleet was commanded by a brilliant general named Agrippa.
So this was a battle that would decide the future of Europe.
Absolutely.
And who won?
Octavian, of course. The Battle of Actium was a disaster for Antony and Cleopatra. Their forces were crushed and they lost their chance at power. They ran back to Egypt and killed themselves. A sad ending to their love story and their political dreams.
So that's it, right? Octavian wins, Antony and Cleopatra are gone, the Senate has no power, game over.
Not quite. Octavian was now the most powerful person in Rome, but he was also very clever. He knew that just declaring himself emperor would be a bad idea. People still remembered what happened to Caesar, and the Senate still had some authority.
So he couldn't just take power by force, he had to be smarter about it.
This is where you really see Octavian's political genius. He started this carefully planned campaign to get more power, but he made it look like he was still respecting the Republic. Appearances were everything, and he was a master at the game.
So he had to keep the Senate happy, but also make himself more powerful. What did he do?
First, he did something very smart. He gave up his emergency powers. He gave them back to the Senate. It made him look good. It was like he was saying, I'm here to serve, not to rule. It made him super popular, and it made people think he was trying to save the Republic, not destroy it like Caesar.
Very clever.
But while he was publicly acting humble, he was secretly gaining more power. He started getting important titles one by one, like princeps, which means first citizen. That meant he was more important than all the other senators. He also became Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of the Roman religion.
So he was adding spiritual authority to his political power.
Exactly. And he did all of this without making too many people angry.
He was playing it perfectly.
And he made sure to create a public image that made him look powerful and likable. He wanted people to think he was a good religious man who was dedicated to Rome, totally different from Caesar, who seemed like a bossy dictator.
So he understood that it wasn't enough to have power. You had to look good while you had it.
He used public works monuments, even poetry, to make himself look great.
Wow.
You could say he was the first Roman emperor to really get branding. He created a story that people believed and that made his rule seem legitimate. And the final piece of this plan happened in 27 BC.
After years of planning and getting more power, how did Octavian finally become emperor?
It was a perfectly planned performance.
Mm.
Octavian pretended to give his power back to the Senate. He knew they wouldn't accept.
Right.
And of course, the Senate begged him to stay in control. They praised his leadership and basically forced him to become emperor. It was brilliant, a peaceful way to turn the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire.
So he made them think they were in charge while he was controlling everything.
Exactly.
And that's how Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome.
And with Augustus in power, the Republic was officially over. The Roman Empire, with all its land, its powerful army, and its long-lasting legacy had begun. But the question is, if Caesar's death in 44 BC was the end of the Republic, why do we say the empire began in 27 BC with Augustus?
Yeah, that's a good question. It seems like there's a gap between the event, the assassination, and what happened because of it, the empire. How do we explain these two different dates?
We have to remember that history isn't always a straight line. There's often a delay between a cause and its effect, a time of change and chaos. Caesar's death was the thing that broke the old system, but it took 17 years of fighting, scheming, and Octavian's political skills to build the empire from the Republic's remains. It was a long and violent journey from the Ides of March to the rise of Augustus.
So it's not enough to just memorize dates. We have to understand the complicated mix of people, events, and choices that shape history.
Exactly. And that's what makes this part of Roman history so interesting. It shows us that history isn't a simple story. It's a complex web of ambition, betrayal, political games, and the never-ending desire for power.
That's a great point. And that's the end of part 2 of our deep dive into Caesar's final act. But we're not done yet. Join us for part 3, where we'll talk about how Caesar's legacy has affected the world, from the emperors who took his name to how his ambition still echoes today. Okay, so we've talked about Caesar's rise to power, how he was assassinated, and then that crazy 17 years that led to the Roman Empire. What a wild ride. But what about Caesar's long-term impact? I mean, does his legacy go beyond, those famous last words and a salad?
Well, Caesar's legacy is complicated. It's kind of like throwing a rock in a pond and watching the ripples spread out. His military victories made Rome's territory bigger and more powerful, and that set the stage for the empire to grow even more.
And we can't forget about that calendar. Every time we look at our phones or plan something, we're using something that's basically named after Caesar.
You got that right. But Caesar's influence goes deeper than just those specific things. He became more than just a historical figure. He became a symbol, like the ultimate ambitious, brilliant, but ultimately tragic leader. His name, Caesar, became a title that meant imperial power. It echoed through history.
like the German Kaiser or the Russian Tsar, they come straight from Caesar's name. It just shows how powerful his legacy is, one name becoming a symbol of authority for so many different cultures over centuries.
And it's not just titles. Artists, writers, thinkers, they've all been fascinated by Caesar's life and death for thousands of years. Like Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar. It explores power, ambition, betrayal, fate. These are themes that still speak to us today.
Yeah, it's amazing how someone from so long ago can still be so interesting and controversial. It's like we're still trying to understand him, to figure out what kind of person he was and what his actions really meant. Some people see him as a brilliant leader who had a vision for Rome. Others think he was a power-hungry dictator who destroyed the Republic.
And that's what's so great about history. It's not about easy answers or saying someone was good or bad. It's about trying to understand complicated people, figuring out their motivations, and seeing how their choices changed the world.
So thinking about all this, what can we learn from Caesar's final act? What lessons from this time in Roman history can we apply to our lives today?
I think there are a few key takeaways that are just as important now as they were back then. First, power is a tricky thing. It can be used for good, like helping leaders make positive changes, but it can also make people corrupt, leading to tyranny and oppression.
It's like a warning about how tempting power can be and how important it is to have checks and balances. Caesar's ambition led to his death and threw Rome into chaos. It reminds us that even the smartest and most charismatic leaders can be corrupted by absolute power.
Absolutely. The second thing is that even when we try to do good things, they can have consequences we don't expect. The senators who killed Caesar really thought they were saving the Republic. But what they did actually caused years of civil war and led to the very thing they were trying to stop, the empire.
Wow. It shows that history isn't always so straightforward. Our actions, even those with good intentions, can cause a chain reaction with unexpected and often bad results.
Yeah, it's a reminder to be humble and remember that we can't always know what will happen because of our choices, no matter how much we think we're doing the right thing.
That's a really important point.
And finally, Caesar's story shows how powerful a legacy can be. His name, his achievements, even his image, they still influence how we see leadership power in Western civilization.
Right, we're still asking the same questions that his life and death brought up. The struggle between personal ambition and what's good for everyone, the fragility of republics, and the never-ending allure and danger of having all the power. It's really interesting how these old problems are still relevant to us today.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Caesar's final act, I want you to think about this. Caesar's story isn't just about ancient Rome. It reflects the human experience, the constant struggle for power and ambition, and the desire to make the world a better place.
And that's something worth thinking about, whether you're a history enthusiast or just someone trying to make sense of the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most important moments in European history. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep that curiosity alive.